episode 150 of Silver Lining for Learning. That's quite a milestone for us. None of us thought when we got started that we would still be 149 episodes later, and we're excited about today's episode. I have a master's student, Linda Rodriguez, who is from the Dominican Republic. She introduced me to the former president of the country. I participated in a conference about educational innovation in Central America and Latin America, and it just was exciting to learn about everything happening in the DR. So we're very happy today to have Maria Waleska Alvarez from Educa and Eladio Jimenez from UNICEF to talk both about the DR and perhaps a bit about the larger region as well. I'm going to ask each to spend 4 or 5 minutes just giving their background and the organization that they work for. So Maria, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Professor Chris. First of all, I would like to thank you the opportunity to share with your audience and your colleagues regarding the Dominican Republic, that it's a country in the middle of the Caribbean between Las Americas. So it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to share with Eladio and all your colleagues. Thank you, Professor. My name is Maria Waleska Alvarez. I used to be a lawyer. But around 20 years ago, I was involved in the technology and the innovation industry. I lead a company that name is NAP del Caribe, from Network Access Point. Is the hub of connectivity of the Caribbean and Central America. But also I'm involved in education as a president of the board of Educa. That it's a business-driven organization for education. Educa was established in the late 80s by a group of businessmen and women who recognized that the crucial role that the education played in our society. Today, Educa is the leading private sector think tank in education in the Dominican Republic, and one of the most influential institutions in education policy debate in our country. We have been also pioneers in the creation of public-private partnerships for the sector. And currently, Educa is a member of the National Education Council, also represents the private sector in the National Council of Higher Education, Science and Technology of the Dominican Republic. Educa is part of the Presidential Education Cabinet that is led by the President, Luis Abinader. And it's also a member of the Latin American Network and Social Organization working in education, the Educa. So thank you for having me here and had the opportunity to share the challenge and also the opportunities in education for the Dominican Republic.
And Eladio?
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you very much, colleagues, for the opportunity of talking to you today and to your audience. As you said, my name is Eladio Jimenez. I have been a teacher at heart and by trade for a little over 20 years now. Since 2004, I have been dealing with online learning, technology integration in education, teacher training, until 2018 when I started working at UNICEF. As you know, UNICEF is the United Nations Fund for Children and Women. It started 75 years ago, and at first I dealt with mostly emergencies, but today globally is well known for its work for children and women across the globe. And in the case of the Dominican Republic, one of our main sector is education. And here we work from foundational learning to prevention of violence in school, to digital integration, and also prevention of pregnancy in teens. So it's a pretty big program in the Dominican Republic. In the case of education, we are probably the biggest partner of the Ministry of Education in terms of the international cooperation framework. And so far, we are supporting the government in terms of foundational learning. Their current policy is one that's called Con Base, sort of with foundation, and it aims at increasing the literacy rates that we have in the first elementary grades, first through third. We're also working in developing a certification of digital competencies for schools, and this aims at a broader framework to ensure that the schools are ready for digital integration. And it looks at everything from the infrastructure to the teachers, to the students, to the families. It's a little bit different from what we've seen before that usually just focuses on devices and teachers. We wanted to take it a little bit further than that. And as I mentioned, there's a policy on prevention of violence in school. As you know, across the globe, violence is a big issue. In our country, it's not different, but we feel that schools play a big role in making sure that we have citizens that have better ways of relating to each other. So that is also for us a very big program. And lastly, I wanted to mention the work that we do in prevention of early marriage and early pregnancy. As you know, also the Dominican Republic in the region has the highest rate of early pregnancy and unions. So for us, it's also a huge issue that we're tackling along with the Ministry of Education.
Well, thank you. And earlier episodes of Silver Lining for Learning, some have been about UNICEF and the wonderful work that they do across the world. So our program started the week that everything shut down with the pandemic. And I'd like to know what happened in the Dominican Republic when the pandemic hit. And were there any supports in place, like some online learning already happening or other things that you could rely on, or was it just a total shock in terms of conventional schools being shut down?
If you allow me, Professor Chris, I would like to start putting in context what we have in terms of the mass in education in the Dominican Republic. We have around 2,060,000 students from the public sector. We also have around 520,000 students from the private sector, for a total of 2.6 million of the students for the Dominican Republic, combined both of the sectors. So when the pandemic started, definitely during the COVID pandemic, the educational systems, like others in the region, was forced to temporarily close educational institutions starting around in March 2020. And that's, as a consequence, it was impacted the 2.6 million of students, but also around 135,000 teachers from the public sector and 60,000 teachers from the private sector. We have in the Dominican Republic 7,360 public schools, and we have 2,800 private schools. So we passed between March 2020 to actually the end of 21 with 0 presential classes, not only in the public sector, but also in the private sector. The Dominican Republic was one of the countries that has the most extended period in what we call homeschooling during the pandemic. So that represents a lot of challenge for assure the properly education for our kids. So at that moment, and actually at the beginning and during the pandemic, Educa was leading and a pioneer institution in providing education through digital media and different platforms to teachers and students in alliance with different institutions and working very closely with the Minister of Education. And of course, with UNICEF, we aim some different projects that we work directly in order to not only prevent the lack of education for the students having all the schools shut down but also trying to adopt technology and improve the opportunity to quality education that during difficult time of period. I don't know if Eladio want to add something, and probably in a couple of minutes we can, go deeply into the different programs that we design and we implement with the Minister of Education and different other institutions. Eladio.
Thank you, Maria. Just wanted to add a little bit of the background, like where this all happens. In one of the biggest challenges at the time was the fact that we were right in the middle of national elections. So that meant that from March, when the pandemic hit, the closure hit, all the way to May and then July, because of some issues we had, we were actually voting. That also meant that there was a change in government in August 16. The following school year, the 2020-2021 was supposed to start on August 18th. So you have the pandemic and you have a school year that is closing, which was just kind of wrapped up, and then a new government coming in with everything that implies, because it was not just a change in president, it was a change in political party. So that was a huge issue at the time in terms of how to ensure sustainability. The second thing that I would like to put in your minds to frame the situation is the huge digital divide that education still has in the Dominican Republic. There has been some advancements, and we will talk about that later probably, but the difference between a public school and a private school is huge. We had public schools that had some systems in place and they could sort of provide some continuity, but many private schools, they just went back home. Next day, everybody was online, on Zoom or other platforms. The same cannot be said of public and some private schools also. So that is important to keep in mind. The country was not really ready to go home and start distance learning. We were not in terms of infrastructure. We were not in terms of teachers' skills for that kind of learning. So just keep that in mind as we discuss what happened after.
But my sense is, in reading the episode description, that even despite this kind of perfect storm of challenges, that the nation really developed a coherent strategy based on 3 innovations that has been very successful. So I'd love to hear more about how that happened, how the new government worked with other groups like Educa and UNICEF to develop what seems to have been a very effective national plan.
I would like probably to add, Professor Chris, that having this perfect storm, as you recall, a very important element during this process of a change of government and a change of political party, the role of the private sector and also the international organizations supporting what was happening in education was probably one of the most differential elements that allowed to the Dominican Republic to be ready to prepare different initiatives to accomplish the goals that we had as a country in terms of how to prepare the schools, the teachers, the students, the families for that process to going directly to a homeschooling process, considering, as Eladio mentioned, that we have a very important social bridges between the different provinces and places in the Dominican Republic, because it's not only the different that we have from the private and the public sector in educational terms, but we also have a very important challenge regarding the internet penetration, regarding even the provision of the light, because we have several places in the Dominican Republic where we have limitations in the light providing for the houses, for the residents. So the most important thing for that perfect storm, in my opinion, was definitely the combination and the leadership and the companion of the international organizations and the private sector working directly in what's happening at that moment for the educational system of the Dominican Republic.
Absolutely. I think that when I look at what happened in other countries in the region, even when the Dominican Republic might have had the longest closure of schools, the one distinctive process that we had in the Dominican Republic was a coincidence of will. Everybody was determined to make sure that students lost the least amount of learning possible. And everybody was just hands on deck, private sector, international community, and the government allowed for that to happen. So it was not one of those situations where the government wanted to go alone. They asked for help. They allowed for the help to be provided. And that led to all of us to also combine our efforts and making sure that everything we did was actually being efficient and that resources were being used efficiently. As Maria mentioned, we worked together in many things. And when, for example, it came to teachers training, at UNICEF, we said, well, we could help, but we believe there's this initiative going on that could be better. So go and work with them. So everyone was just focusing on what everyone could do would help the country move forward in the middle of that perfect storm, as you put it.
I guess it's me coming in here now. I want to say, for those of you who are watching the stream, welcome to show 150. So those who are listening can't see the sign I'm holding up. It's 150, as Chris mentioned here earlier. Some of you, again, don't see, but I'm wearing a Korean shirt from Qatar, from the World Cup. I got various gifts. I don't know why I got a winter hat and scarf. But anyways, the reason I'm wearing this, I did get a hat as well. It is Teachers Day on Monday. It is Teachers Day somewhere around the world. It's Teachers Day in Korea. And to celebrate every year on Teachers Day and for the full week before, I go running in Korean outfits. And so this is my garb for today's run. Now, because it's Teachers Day, we have to think about what you did for teachers during the pandemic, and I'm really curious about what happened. What happened, what's still happening, what transferred, what stayed, what principles that you implemented during the pandemic had staying power, had value, were things that you could build on post-pandemic. So a couple of things I want to know, what remains, and what advice would you have for others that would try and replicate what you did? What were the principles perhaps, or the components or the features that made it viable, that made it, hopefully it was successful, including the evaluation estimates or the assessment measures. So I want to know a little bit about the whole gamut. And finally, I'll just point out for those listening that Vanessa Denon and I are doing a special issue on teaching people how to teach online, basically, online teaching and learning, professional development, in the journal called Internet and Higher Education, a top-tier journal. We've done 2 special issues already, and this is our 3rd one in everyone in a different journal. But anyways, if you've done any research, please submit it. We've not actually announced it yet. This is the first announcement of it, live on the air on Silver Lining for Learning. You're hearing it right now. Again, welcome to show 150. And Maria and Eladio, would you like to elaborate on the principles, components, those things that are still having some kind of impact today, what transferred to the current environments, and so forth?
Well, let's see. Many things still remain, because what was done as a response to the pandemic actually was something that needed to be done even before the pandemic, in terms of teacher training, for example. We knew we needed to support our teachers to be better at using technology. We kind of lagged behind because, nothing was actually forcing us to do it. The pandemic came about and made us realize this is not something for the future. This is something that we need right now. So on the one end, we continue to work on teacher training, and Educa, it's doing a wonderful job in supporting the Ministry of Education in that aspect. That combined with the work that we're doing now for the certification of digital competencies for schools. In fact, we developed that project right after the pandemic started because we noticed what had happened. In my case, as part of my studies for my PhD, I did a research on teachers and the effects that it had, that the pandemic had on them in terms of their mental health, in terms of the workload. And the one thing that every teacher across the country told us is we did not feel prepared. We did not feel like we had what it took to do this job online. The second thing that was obvious is nobody was thinking about teachers' mental health. And I think that was a big issue. We did develop from UNICEF a phone line for mental health support that continues still today. In fact, I was told this week that there is a project that started last week to increase the number of people available to support teachers on mental health to do this online. So this is also something that continues to be done and to be improved to ensure that teachers have that their health is also taken care of, kind of caring for the caretaker sort of thing. The one thing that I believe still needs more improvement, so to speak, would be the issue on evaluation, as you mentioned, Kurt. Because something we also noticed during the pandemic, and this is something that we noticed across the region, even as we were coming out of the pandemic, being able to determine how much loss of learning happened was very difficult. Big countries like Brazil, like Mexico, started kind of playing with this thing, but the best we had at the time was what the World Bank did last year around June, where they kind of estimated how bad things were for students in estimation in terms of school closure. But there, we still have work to do. We are working with the government to, with the Ministry of Education, to ensure that we can evaluate learning, to evaluate where our students are and what are the best approaches to kind of save that gap. But I feel that that's where we still need to do some work.
Maria, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would like to add a couple of elements, especially trying to respond to your question that what were our learnings, and our recommendations, considering the process that we live in the Dominican Republic. And I probably will start saying that, as Eladio mentioned, nobody was prepared for what was happening at that moment, and a lot of things was going on, especially with the political side, with the changes that we, as a country, we were living. So in that moment, and considering that we were, very understood about the difficult situation, the first things that we made in Educa was precisely to design and the training for education in virtual environments for teachers, for families, and for students. Understood that we realized that the first things that we need to do is improve the skills and the competencies, not only for the teachers, but also for the families that were involved in the educational process at that time. So in order to respond to that need, an institutional alliance was formed. And the alliance was formed and composed precisely by the Minister of Education of the Dominican Republic, the United Nations Development Program, the Dominican Association of Universities Headmasters, and the Business Action for Education, Educa. And also the alliance had the support for the National Institution of Technical and Vocational Training and the Salome Ureña Higher Institute of Teacher Training. As you can see, it was a mixed effort from the academical sector, the government, the private sector, and international multilaterals. So probably my first reflection at that moment, that in order to be able to prepare that environment and the properly and the faster response that at that moment the educational systems was needing, it was necessarily the involvement of the main stakeholders of the Dominican Republic. And that will probably my first reflection will be that in order to respond to the challenges that we have in education in the different countries, it is definitely necessarily to be able to have a very strong public and private alliance working for the education. So in terms of how we did it at that moment, and we create and design and implement the program, basically aim to provide the Dominican Republic educational system having teachers and technical pedagogical personnel in all the levels and all the areas with the skills and the competencies in order to be able to teach through digital platforms. So the program was basically established in two phases. The first one was related to the asynchronous and synchronical training process in the fundamental skills for remote teaching, how we teach people, how we teach the teachers in order to teach by a different environment that they used to be. And the second component, and probably one of the most important, consists in the digital support and assistance through the creation of autonomous dynamic learning communities. Having the opportunity to create communities between the different teachers in order that they have the support, the system, the collaboration, that was one of the key elements. So my second reflection, Professor Court, is the necessity of creating environments and the communities for the collaboration between the teachers, between the directors, between the technical personnel that works directly in the schools. So at the beginning, in that project, the objectives was train around 100,000 teachers. However, the training exceeds our goal and our expectation. And at the end was possible precisely for the strong public-private alliance to impact and to train directly 150,000 teachers. And as a part of the program, we were able to create around 3,900 autonomous learning communities through the teachers, not only from the public sector, but also from the private sector. Of all those teachers that was impacted by the program, around 90% represents the public sector, but around 10% it was from the private sector too. So at the end, I think that even we still have several challenges and still have the obligation to continue preparing and providing to our teachers with the digital skills that right now is necessarily to be part of the educational systems. One of the, I will say, one of the exits of the project was in first place has the opportunity to work directly with almost all the teachers of the Dominican Republic, because actually the ones that wasn't not part of the program was related for the lack of connectivity or power in their places. It was around 7%, hopefully just a minority. But the most important thing was the creation of this collaboration communities, because at the end that provide to the teacher the opportunities to talk, to assist themselves, is one of the most stronger actually elements of the project. This project, I feel very proud about it. because not only impact almost all the teachers in the Dominican Republic, but through this project, actually, Educa and the Dominican government was recognized from the Latin American Network for Digitalization of Education. And later, we received a recognition for the New York Senate, actually, for the innovation and the elements that we was able to put in place at that moment in the middle of the pandemic, and with a very limited resource, not only for the teachers, but also for the families.
I'm curious, because you talk about collaboration communities. I had a student do a dissertation on collaboration communities of teachers in Korea, where it's Teachers' Day on Monday. Again, I'll repeat. And two other students at the same time. I had 3 students doing dissertations on this topic at the same time. Then I wrote a paper on the 15 or 20 principles to create a community of practice of teachers. So are those communities sustainable? Are they still in operation post-pandemic? And what do you see as the key aspects of keeping those sorts of communities vibrant and places where people join in, continue to increase in terms of their knowledge sharing and knowledge getting and identity and other kinds of things that happen in communities? Are they still around, and what formats do they have? I assume it's social media. It may be mini events, symposia and conferences and so forth online. What are the things that other people can do to create similar collaboration communities?
Well, that's a challenge, Professor Court, how to maintain. During the pandemic, the people and the teachers and the systems will involve in different innovation, because we do not have options. So, but when we go back to the reality in the presence in the school, the challenge is how to maintain the hybrid model and how we assure the adoption. And in our case, and in Educa, we talk about intelligent adoption of technology in order to improve the educational systems. So what we did, and during all the pandemic process, and actually once we rebased the pandemic, what we did was we maintained different courses, different activities, different ways to maintain the teachers connected to this innovation environment. And we have been and we have presented several proposals to the Minister of Education in how to adopt the technology. In the Dominican Republic, we have been the effort to deliver it to the teachers and the students. Around 1.7 million of devices has been delivered to the community, to the educational community. So the proposal that we presented to the Minister of Education is in different ways. One of the dimensions that we propose is continuing with the hybrid model, including technology as a part of the policies that is implemented in the schools. But also the other element that we have been promoting is definitely to maintain the multi-platform educational content. Because in the Dominican Republic, as a part of the effort that we had to make during the pandemic, it was necessarily to create all the classes and all the levels that the school, the Dominican educational system has in the pre-university system. And we have the conscience that everything do not have internet connectivity and digital devices. So all these platforms and all this content was prepared and produced in order to be able to deliver and share to television, digital channels as YouTube, virtual classes, but also by radio. So that's the reason that we talk about multi-platform educational content that right now the Dominican Republic has, and it was a very high level content of all the classes, of all the levels. And the idea is use the technology in order to provide to the students, to the teachers, to the families, all this content, even we are again in the class, that they will be able to use this content as a supplement, as a complementary in order to improve the quality of the education of our kids.
Thank you very much.
Kurt, if I may add just one more thing on this. As you mentioned, sustainability of community of practice is a huge issue. We did a little bit of research on that a few years back. And the one thing that seems to help make it more sustainable is to make sure that these communities have more than one scope. What I mean is, you have these communities at the school level, and that is sort of easier to maintain when you have a leader in the school that can support that exchange of knowledge. Then at the district level, it's a bit more complex, but if you have someone at the district level that can be your pioneer for that group of schools, here a district could have anywhere from 10 schools to 100. So sometimes it's hard to find these kind of people that can be at the forefront. But if you are able to create these leaders in this scope, they can be maintained. And we have seen it happen with other topics. The other thing that I wanted to add, when it came to multi-platform, it also meant very low tech. In some cases, no tech at all. One of the things that UNICEF did during the pandemic was provide printed content for their first grades, which are the grades where even if they have access to technology, it's a little bit harder considering the process of early literacy and early math. So part of what happened during those 2 years that we were closed was that we had to create content that was designed for students to do it at home, in paper, with the support of their parents and the support of the TV channels. As Maria mentioned, there was content being delivered through the TV, through YouTube, through the radio. But one of the things that I also feel was very particular in the Dominican Republic is that we designed a TV channel for parents. So what we did was we started thinking about those parents that didn't have that much education themselves. So here I am giving the students something to do at home with no support. So how do we support parents to be able to support their children? So we took the materials that were sent home for the students, and we did mini lessons, so to speak, for TV, where we told parents what they could do, how they could support their children. So I think that also made a huge impact in the uptake of this content and in being able to support students throughout the 2 years that we were studying from home.
Us educational psychologists call that two-tiered scaffolding. Thank you for that. Punya's going to jump in here, I think.
Sure, thank you. So this one, I think the question a little bit more targeted towards you, Eladio, because before we started the show, you mentioned, and particularly given your role with UNICEF, that you get to see responses across, the countries in the neighborhood as well. So maybe you can speak to some sort of the same points that Kurt raised, but how do you see differences between what happened in the Dominican Republic, whether other countries in and around in the same geographical area? And Maria, you're of course welcome to jump in if you have any insights or thoughts that you would like to share.
Thank you, Punya. In the region, when we look at what happened during the pandemic, the DR stands out because it had the longest closure. That's one thing that from the get-go makes a huge difference. While you had countries, for example, in Argentina, where early childhood education centers didn't close for the most part, here they closed throughout the 2 years. When you had places like Mexico, where the decision of opening or closing was based on each state, here you have only one decision. It is the national level. So when it was closed for everybody. Now, That being said, where I think the DR shined is in maintaining multiple ways of learning, even when we were at home. So not every country was successful in helping families take on the learning process from home. Many countries did create a lot of content. However, it was not being accessed by family. When we look at what happened in the DR, most families, over 60% of the families, were accessing the content, whether it was television, whether it was the radio. And in the case of the printed materials, it was over 90% of the families that received these materials. So you have these distinctions in terms of the kind of closure versus going back into the classroom. There we had our issues, but we were able to bring everybody a lot faster. To give you another example, Dominican Republic was one of the first in the region to have all of their teachers vaccinated. It was done quite fast. When we were already back in the classroom, because everybody was vaccinated in terms of teachers, we still had countries in the region that were up to 25, 30% of the teachers with vaccination. So yes, the DR took longer to reopen, and from UNICEF, we did a lot of advocacy because we also recognize that reopening school is not just a matter of learning. No, especially for the youngest ones, this socialization that happens in school is critical for their development. And in my case, my other role in UNICEF's office here, I am the early childhood development officer. So my core job, so to speak, was to make sure that younger children had the opportunity of these experiences that are so important for their development. So there, I have to say, compared to the region, there were countries that never closed early childhood centers or had them in reduced capacity, but there was always this space. Sadly, DR did not have that. And again, in terms of the duration of the closure, we would struggle. But when it came to the comprehensiveness of the response, making sure that everyone was in, that everybody had access to a learning situation, there, I think that the Dominican Republic had a very good response to the crisis.
Thank you. Maria, any thoughts?
Yeah, I probably would like to add that we have around 60,000 hours of record high quality educational content that is related to each level of the classes for all the different areas. And as Eladio mentioned, that was part of the content that was able to put available for all the teachers, the students, and the families through different platforms. But they also, we have been working very closely with the Minister of Education in allow and avoid the risk of not consolidating the hybrid model and in return to what we call the outdated education that is not longer have any place in this current time. So probably the difference between the Dominican Republic and the other countries is that having the Dominican Republic with the most long close of the schools, we had the obligation to implement for many more time the hybrid model, and that's probably a different. And the other one that is really important is the Dominican Republic has allocated in the last 10 years the 4% of its GDP that today represent an investment of around over $28 billion that has been invested in education. Unfortunately, even we have the political willingness, independent of the government that is in place, to continue with the investment in technology, and this is something very positive to the Dominican Republic. For the other side, unfortunately, even that type of effort that the Dominican Republic society is doing in education, unfortunately, we do not have the results in quality that we dream as a country. And that's the reason that we believe and we understand that we need to focus very well what we did during the pandemic, the inclusion of those innovations and those learnings and those initiatives, and be sure that we include it again as a hybrid model in the education. So I will probably say that a very different element, Punya, was that we have one of the most largest investments in education, but we have the worst results in quality education. So when you have that, you definitely are in an inflection point as a country. And that's
Thank
where
you.
the Dominican Republic it is. We are in that inflection point where we need to jump or release.
I
So,
would like
So
to,
Zhao has
sorry,
a question
Punya.
here.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
just-
Eladio.
Thank you. Just to add to that last part of Maria's intervention, we have been part of a regional study for the last, I would say 12 years. I think the first one was back in 2011. Every year we have been, or every study, it's done about every 4 years. In every study, we come last. Even when there's been years where other countries have lost points compared to the previous one, and we have gained points, we still come last. That much of a difference is between us and countries in the region. Even after an increment in the investment in education. And just to give you an idea, before we started investing 4%, the highest we ever got was 2.7. So since 2012, we've had the highest investment in education of our history, and it is currently the one ministry that receives the most funding from the government right now. Now, what we have noticed is it is hard to get better results in 6th grade, where we measure in 3rd and 6th in these studies, if you're having issues with foundational learning, if you're having issue with early literacy, early math. So that is why also part of the focus of our country here, the country office, is in supporting early learning, because we know if we can get our 1st, 2nd, and 3rd graders to learn at the level they're supposed to, then the other grades will follow suit. So I just wanted to put that also there, the fact that the main issues are in these early grades in terms of literacy and early math.
So thank you. So apparently you've done amazing, during the pandemic, but also heard Maria says the largest investment, the slowest, lowest quality. Eladio says that as well. And I also, just always wonder, when people say, Kurt said, we're doing teacher training. Yeah, I want to say, okay, are you doing the right teacher training? So because we sometimes heard about teacher training, we assume it's good. Well, what if you were doing the wrong thing? You're training teachers to do harm to students. When we hear about education, we think education is good. What if sometimes education actually is bad? So what I really want to invite you to think and ask you the question, because as Chris, our show has always featured changes in that make sense. A lot of changes do not make sense, right? You can have a lot of money, but investing in the wrong thing. So, right, I mean, I was just checking in the Dominican Republic. You have over 10 million people, about 3 or 4 million lives in the Santo Domingo area. That means your largest concentration. And, your GDP is quite, high, it's improving, it's dramatic, it's quite interesting. And so, really, I don't believe in the PISA, which PISA puts you in a low level. It's actually a bad test. A lot of times, when you say you want to drive to early literacy, early math, it may not actually be the best idea to drive that. Instead, you get the kids engaged. But that's not really. That's just I'm commenting on those points. We got to define a better education, because you as a country, that's just amazing. Now you have this investment and you've gone through all this, pandemic innovations. So I was just wondering, what's your country's definition of a good education, and a good teaching? What is good teaching? And because we've seen through our shows, many different innovations in many different countries that involves in redefining what to teach, what should we teach, how we should teach, how we should organize teaching. So both Maria and Eladio, please feel free to jump in with any of your thoughts about that. I was just really curious to say, not the technical changes, but the fundamental content, philosophical level changes. What would make a good Dominican Republican in 15 years, right? And that should not be judged by other countries or by international organizations. It's your organization, you have your uniqueness. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor John. Definitely, we need as a country a lot to think about it. And actually, precisely having this situation that we already described, Educa has developed a new educational management project, and it's subject into controlled experimentation in a small but significant number of educational centers that represents the diversity of reality observed in the Dominican educational system. Because until this point, we have as a country, we have been very successful in creating the educational policies. Where we have been struggling as a country is how to implement that policies in the classmates, in the school, with the kids. So we have a very strong and very adapted curricula policies. And as a country, we have been very successful in even accomplish with international standards. But what we have the challenge is how to implement all those policies and all those programs in the classmates with the students. So for that reason, during the pandemic, actually, we, as Educa, we create a program with the president, since that the program's name is Presidential Project for Educational Excellence. And the idea was using the same resources, using the same teachers, the same students, with the involvement of the family, with the same content that our schools do, to do different things. And at that point, actually, we start with the project during the pandemic, using different methodologies, using design thinking, actually, as a prototype that was developed and applied during the school year of 2002 and 2003 in 55 educational centers through all the country. And I will put some examples of the changes that we identify. For example, in third grade in Spanish language, 30.8% of the students achieved a satisfactory level in the pre-test, while in the post-test, this relative value increased to 48% just in 90 days. In mathematics, in the same grade, around 34% of the students reach a satisfactory level in the pre-test, while in the post-test, they reach around 34% of the students reach the satisfactory level. Just to put two examples in Spanish language and math, that as Eladio mentioned, and you mentioned, the basics of the education. So as a part of this project that is using design thinking and actually start during the pandemic, we basically see a very important improvement, and as I mentioned, in just 90 days. So what we are working with the government right now is precisely to expand this project to 100 centers more the next year. And basically this new way to manage and to use the same resources that they already have allocated in the schools are articulated in 5 components: human talent, curricular intelligence, cross-cutting technology, institutional and pedagogical management, and information for the decision makings. Something that we realized as a part of this project is that we need to use the data as one of the most important instruments to take and to make important decisions, not at the level of the Minister of Education, but also in the class with the students. Provide that type of information to the teachers, to the directors, to the technical personnel that is working directly with the students. So we are optimistic. We feel we have the hope that this type of new ways to see the education will allow to the Dominican Republic to increase the quality of the education, because we recognize that as a society, we're making the biggest effort in terms of investing in education. So now the private sector and the international organizations are also being very fierce in the advocacy that we need to do in terms of the use of the public resources in education. And with this type of prototypes, we are trying to provide to the government with the evidence that what are the type of changes that we need to start to implement, and how as a country we are able to close the bridge between the policies and the policies that we have as a country, and how we are implementing the real changes in the class. So our hope is that this type of prototype and experimental projects allow to provide that type of evidence, and hopefully in the next years we have a different results in the different areas of our kids.
Eladio, did you want to add to that?
Thank you, Chris. Precisely because they are looking at how resources are being used and how they can support what happens in the classroom. And going back to the idea of a different teaching, and I would like to say a different kind of learning, I'm always pushing for the discussion to not only be focused on what the teachers do, but what should happen with a person so they can learn, right? So part of what we're doing is precisely putting together in those places where, for example, Educa is prototyping this model, where the private sector is also prototyping a certain model. We are also putting in there these new pedagogical models in terms of different ways of a different way of learning. And this is our focus, particularly for the first grades, where we want to make sure that our students have the skills to hone in their learning. That is not this traditional method where you have this all-knowing teacher and then you have the student that gets there to receive their wisdom. We want to make sure that our students have the skills to read, to understand, and to create even more knowledge and information. And absolutely, as Maria said, we are pushing a lot of work in terms of data, in terms of information, because we want to be able to, yes, look at what happens at the macro level, but we want to be able to also work with that one child where they are at and what they need to make sure that they can reach their full potential. So I think that would be one of the greatest achievements that we can get as a country, where we can see each one of our students, meet them where they are, and help them become the best version they want to be of themselves.
So as always, we're running out of time before we run out of great ideas. One thing that you said early on that I found very impressive is that every single stakeholder in the country rallied together, aligned, and rapidly made a big difference. Could each of you take just 1 minute and tell our listeners what advice you would give to another country or another region who would like to get all of the stakeholders into the water together? What secret sauce do you have that might allow them to do that?
Well, Professor Chris, I don't think that exists actually the secret sauce for anybody. It's quite difficult in education, but definitely I believe that the first thing that we need to do in every country is to put in the middle of the conversation the kids. because at the end, the most important in education, it's the kids that we are trying to learn, and to learn in quality. And we think, and in Educa, we are convinced that we need to rethinking the educational models in the different countries, because we are not the same place, we are not the same world that 100 years ago. And unfortunately, if we saw all the industry, all has been able to transform, less education. And we're still having the same educational models for mostly all the countries. So the first thing will be definitely we need to rethink the model and how we are learning, we're teaching the kids. The second one was definitely to put in the middle of the conversation and in the middle of the agenda the kids what we're trying to teach. And third, definitely to do that and to have human talent prepared for the challenge of the present and the future. We need to work together. We as a country, we really believe in the strength and the benefits of the public-private alliance. And we believe that the only way to overcoming the challenges that we have in education is working together.
Eladio, any quick thoughts?
Well, as Maria said, we at UNICEF always put the child at the center of the discussion. And there's one thing that I believe helped making the case for us. Everything we did was information driven, was data driven. We were monitoring everything that happened day by day, literally. And being able to show the data in terms of what's happening was critical. Being able to show the data in terms of where we were coming from in terms of education also helped. And being able to share the data on what it means to each kind of stakeholder. If we didn't do anything, I think that also helped in bringing everybody in. So this was a scenario where everybody was also clear as to what stood to be lost if we didn't do anything, and what were the gains that we had if we did what we needed to do, everyone chipping in from their expertise. So I think it was that combination of everybody focused on our students in the first place, but then also being clear as to what the cost of inaction would have been. And I think that was critical.
Well, I just want to thank both of you for taking the time to share the exciting things happening and to discuss, the kinds of strategies that are really important in these situations. So thanks again to both of you. Punya, will you quickly tell us about the next episode?
Sure. So again, thank you, Maria and Eladio, for joining us today and sharing your experience and thoughts. Next episode, next Saturday, education is typically considered a human right, but for 450 million young people living in conflict zones, schooling is usually an early casualty of war. And so I think this is a great episode for Silver Lining for Learning, because the original idea actually emerged right in the pandemic at Arizona State University, and which we actually didn't continue. But what happened was, I remember meeting with Michael Phillips, a professor at Monash, and connecting him to people here, Jody Donner and others at ASU, which led to the setting up of Monash Virtual School. And so that was aimed at basically providing teachers opportunities to continue their professional learning and practice during the pandemic. And then it has continued to grow, and they have over time collaborated with Classrooms Without Walls, and they provide opportunities for young people in Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Ukraine. So it's a very exciting project, and we will have 3 guests with us: Michael Phillips and Tara Mannix from Monash, and David Falconer, founder of Classroom Without Borders. I should mention that it is at a different time. It's at 8 p.m. Eastern, because we are trying to get people from Australia, Canada, and of course, all 4 of us together. So that'll be 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. here in Arizona and 10 a.m. on Sunday in Melbourne. So we are trying to make sure that everybody is in a reasonable time zone for this. So with that, happy Mother's Day coming up tomorrow, and look forward to seeing you for episode 151 next Saturday at 8 p.m. Thank you very much.